Hello and welcome to episode 9 of The Briefing Room. This week I shall be talking to Thomas Weber about his book, Becoming Hitler. I've never read the story about Hitler before, from his involvement with the Red Army to the lack of his inhuman status. This should be a deeply interesting conversation. So, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the other side. For now, history. Okay, Thomas Weber, thank you very much for joining me on the briefing room. And today we're going to be talking about your book, Becoming Hitler. This was awesome read. It was fantastic. And I could talk to you about every single page in it because I couldn't put it down.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. The first thing I want to say is that I was reading this book at work and somebody put a complaint in that I was reading your book. And that just showed me that Hitler, even 80 years later, is a trigger for some people. He's still relevant today. So that was shocking to me that somebody would be offended by a biography. But in your book, it focuses on from 1918 to 1926. Why that period of time? Why did you choose that period of time?
Because in a way, I really wanted to understand how Hitler was radicalized. We do know, at least at the time, I thought we know a lot about Hitler in power. Actually, the more and more I study Hitler, the more and more I realize how little we know about Hitler. But that's maybe something for later. So initially, when I started to work on Hitler far too long ago, I thought that a lot of the stories about Hitler was radicalized, how he became the man who we all know, somehow just didn't add up. And so I initially really looked at the period of Hitler during the First World War and realized that these kind of old stories about how the war supposedly made Hitler didn't really quite add up. So that Hitler returned from the war being unlike what he would later claim. He was not a typical product of the regiment. National Socialism wasn't born in the trenches of the First World War. He was not the kind of Nazi in the making who returned from the war to bring Germany back from its feet. And then afterwards, I kind of thought I was done with Hitler, but then people kept on saying, well, you can't tell us how Hitler was not made, and now not tell us how Hitler and not tell us how he was made. And then I became, I guess, curious again. And this kind of idea of, I mean, not just with Hitler, but how seemingly normal people are sometimes suddenly lured by the attractions of extremism is something
Mm.
that has always sustained me, and that is also really just fascinating me to the present day.
Yeah, reading your book, in my head I was translating it into today's political environment, and unfortunately, it seems to mirror quite a lot, especially in the UK.
Yes,
And
absolutely. So glad. Yes.
and how did you fundamentally challenge the self-serving image that he presents himself in Mein Kampf?
Really through lots and lots of lag room, so lag work and long hours in archives, in trying to find descendants of people close to Hitler to find new material. I think that is maybe also the reason why even though there's so many books on Hitler, a lot of them maybe do not provide so much new insight because ultimately it is if you really want something if you want to say something new, it's normally based there's no shortcuts. You really have to spend years and years in archives, and what I was trying to do there is I was trying to find traces of Hitler's early life, of things he didn't want us to see, to in order to kind of contrast that with the kind of story that Hitler himself was telling, because the story that we ultimately have of Hitler is is a upside down version of the story Hitler himself wanted to tell for political gain. Because Hitler really, I mean, something I also hadn't really appreciated originally was how little Hitler initially talked about himself. When he first entered politics, he just gave all these speeches where he talked about the nature of things, but not about himself. And that suddenly changed almost overnight. About a year or so, or a year and a half before he started writing Mein Kampf. And when he suddenly pivoted to telling everything through his own life, but what he did was he created a politically useful version of his life, um, through which he also tried as to create a space in politics for him. I mean, he was a dropout. He was technically a foreigner. There normally would have been no space for someone like him in German politics, but he very cleverly presented himself that he fit this kind of longing for this guy coming from nowhere, for this kind of guy who would be a genius, who would see this hidden architecture of the world. And so Hitler just invented a useful past for himself, and told it in Mein Kampf and elsewhere, and which was then endlessly repeated by Nazi propaganda ever since. And also was, I would say, fairly uncritically believed by most other historians and the general public. And my attempt really now was to find evidence where we could contrast his own story with what really happened.
In retelling the Hitler story with a whole new look at it, did you have any negative feedback?
Of course, more broadly, it's been interesting to see over I guess I have now for more than 20 years worked on Hitler. It's always interesting to see how people respond to my working on Hitler. Um, and I could see particularly early in the day as I was starting to work on Hitler and no one really knew me. And I was, for instance, first in this archive in Bavaria and asked for material on his regiment. And I
Mhm.
could see how the archivist, he was ostensibly, I mean, he was trying to remain really professional and nice, but you could see how he was kind of trying to prevent to roll his eyes. Well, not yet again, someone working on, asking on Hitler and more broad. And although I actually have to say, in his defense, once he realized um, what I was doing and I kept on coming back, he was wonderful. But more broadly, the experience I've had is that for a long time there was a tremendous interest in the general public about what I was doing. And particularly also people who are concerned about what's happening in their own world. But sometimes, particularly within academia, working on Hitler is not seen as the coolest of things. I mean, it's
Yeah.
then this kind of thing, why is this guy working on Hitler? Or don't we already know everything on Hitler? And then there's also the version of why why should we focus so much on Hitler? That's particularly a German concern. There's this kind of
Yeah.
concern. Um, that if you focus too much on Hitler, that maybe somehow takes responsibility away from ordinary Germans. Because in the early 1950s in West Germany, it is true that a lot of people just conveniently blamed everything on Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler, who were all conveniently dead, and that kind of let them allowed themselves to get off the hook themselves. And as a result of that, for perfectly honorable reasons, there has been relatively little engagement really with Hitler in Germany itself. And so my experience is when my books came out also in Germany, that often kind of afterwards, even sort of with journalists, once the interview was once they had switched off the recording devices, they would start to ask us, "This is really great, but are you not worried that you're accused of X, Y, and that?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's always there, and which I really do not get anywhere else other than in Germany. However, there's the last point I'm going to say about this. I think this is really starting to change, and we realized this last year when I mean, I've been involved in as a consultant and as advisor for the first series feature film on Hitler in 20 years, which came out last year,
Mhm.
Führer, Verführer, or Goebbels and the Führer. Um, And there also there was a tremendous hesitation inside of Germany to even financially so by public film boards and so on to support this film again because of this fear of uh, dealing with Hitler. And but the film was made anyway, in part under the radar, really, and with a much smaller budget than expected, and so on, because the filmmakers really thought this film really has to be made. But we were very nervous when the film came out. But then something really maybe surprising happened, or maybe not so surprising happened. The film immediately won the Audience Award at the Munich International Film
Wow.
Festival, where it premiered, and also realized while there was a small number of critics who again focused on this why we really don't need a film on Hitler, the majority of reviews, maybe 80%, 90%, were really positive. And I
Mhm.
think I realized that in a way, Germany had suddenly really started to move on. And I think that's maybe because of what's happening in the world. I mean, in a way, this kind of isn't it dangerous to deal with Hitler and all that. That was in a way very much a 1990s, early 2000s concern. But with now the what's happening in Ukraine and Putin and other right-wing leaders, or in fact with Reform UK, we suddenly see that there is again
Yeah.
all these leaders coming up, these people who are tremendously successful in demagoguery, also in disinformation. And I think people suddenly realize also in Germany, it's a bit silly to say you should only look at the people or
Yeah.
at Hitler's underlings, but not at Hitler himself, but that surely you should look at the interaction.
I think the hesitation from your look at Hitler may be because, and this is from my reading of your book, that Hitler comes across as more human.
Hmm.
Um, he's not presented as some, really black evil force. He's presented as somebody with faults, somebody who gets beaten up in your book. So he's fallible, and I think
Absolutely.
that makes people nervous.
I think that is true. But the what I keep on saying when I'm being asked about either with this, particularly with the film, but also with the book, isn't there a danger of humanizing Hitler? And my answer always is the danger is not lies in not humanizing Hitler.
Yeah, yeah,
if you
exactly.
create if you create this kind of demon figure, this kind of one-dimensional demon figure of Hitler, the kind of guy who is always just screaming and shouting and raging and is only driven by hate and who doesn't really think, then in a way uh, it's problematic on two levels. For one, I think it's really wrong. And as scholars, at the end of the day, our only commitment has got to be seeking truth, and so we can't just say for societal reasons that's not Hitler was different than he was, but
Mhm.
also from a societal point of view, it is really dangerous to get Hitler wrong because if you portray Hitler as this one-dimensional guy who shouts and screams all the time and is only driven by primordial hatreds, then you're looking for the wrong warning signs in today's
Yeah.
world. Then I mean, those people do exist, but they are dangerous. They will be dangerous if you encounter them in a dark alley, but they will not bring democracy to its knees. It's really people who look like us, who talk like us, who maybe also have winning sides,
Yeah.
but yet who turn everything, who turn all our persuasions and convictions upside down. They are the real dangerous people, and that is, I think, why it's really important to take Hitler seriously, and also, which is the kind of language I didn't use so much in the book at the time, but I've been using more recently, is to really look at the first person perspective of extremism. There is the generally in radicalization and extremism research, there is more of a focus, or for a long time, there was more of a focus on looking at third person perspective. So, what other people, what we as scholars see kind of big macro explanations, group explanations, and so on, but not really to take seriously the way what the extremists themselves, how they see the world. And that is even more true. So, because I mean, in extremism research generally outside of history, there's really been in recent years a move towards realizing how important it is to look at the first person perspective of extremism. That hasn't really quite arrived uh, yet too much in historical research, and certainly not on research on Hitler. But I think it's absolutely important that we take the first person perspective of Hitler seriously, how he looked at the world,
Mm.
how he thought he was trying to repair the world. Um, it's absolutely clear that in the process he destroyed the world, but from his own perspective, he was trying to repair the world. And the Hitler also, for instance, I mean, also as I show in the book, um, he already said in his first written statement, we need an anti-Semitism of reason, not of emotion. So he himself keeps on saying anti-Semitism isn't really, or our politics, that's not really about hatred or revenge. It needs to be something far more comprehensive. Um, the it it might well be true, and it almost certainly is true, that hatred still played a role. So I'm not saying that we have to now ignore the third person perspective and say and believe everything Hitler says. Quite to the contrary. But for instance, I mean, I think this case is a perfect example to actually show how important it is to look at the first person perspective. Because if Hitler really was just driven by hatred, then his anti-Semitism would have probably been an anti-Semitism of pogroms. It would have been an anti-Semitism
Yeah.
where it would have been very unpleasant, where maybe also hundreds or thousands of people would have been killed, but not 6 million people would have been killed. Once he says this is actually not about emotions, once he medicalizes the problem, once he actually says the because of the supposedly racial characteristics of Jews are so dangerous and their ideas are so dangerous that we can only survive if we comprehensively wipe out that influence. Once he says this is the equivalent of that you can't make a compromise with the TBC bacillus or something like that, but you really have got to drive to get everything out of the body in order to survive. Then you
Mm.
realize why this first person perspective has genocidal consequences.
Yeah.
And we can just go on and on and on. So, for instance, what I've also since bringing out Becoming Hitler, what I've been working on a little bit is for instance, how Hitler looks at sovereignty, where power comes, sorry, political authority, where authority comes from.
Hmm.
And I realized, for instance, that sure, he's raging against democracy, he's destroying democracy, but he is also saying, um, we need to create a better democracy. So he's not saying we should go back to the old days, nor is he saying power is just a result of force, but he's actually saying, look where liberal, Marxist, left wing, Western, American, British can go on and on. Democracy got us, but what we need is real democracy. Um, and we also need to understand how Hitler presents himself here in order to not only understand what drove Hitler, but also how he drove others. Then it suddenly becomes far more comprehensible why so many people would support Hitler.
Yeah, and what I found really interesting about Hitler as well is he doesn't concentrate on the past, but he uses the past to model the now. He's a very strong historian, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. History is really everything for him. I mean, the today we kind of increasingly speak about applied historians, about or applied history, about turning towards the past in order to find answers for the challenges of the present and the future. And that's precisely what Hitler did. I mean, he
Mm.
was kind of a very early practitioner, both actually theory actually not just practitioner of applied history, also almost someone who is into the theory of it. It's because in a way, from his own understanding, he was kind of both a man of ideas, almost kind of political philosopher or political theorist,
Hmm.
as well as a political practitioner. Um, so once Hitler had realized what the that there's a fundamental problem that Germany was facing after the First World War in order to survive. He really then was not just trying to somehow somewhere find a perfect answer that he can just adopt, but he was then starting to be a man who, for the next several years, was trying to seek an answer, who was understanding, who's trying from his own perspective to understand the hidden architecture of the world. People often say that Hitler was reading with confirmation bias, that he was only reading small parts of books and so on. Sure, that is all true. I mean, for one, I could say, well, who doesn't? But even ignoring that, the important bit here still is that for years, for pretty much all of his adult life, almost every night of his adult life, he reads, and he reads nonfiction, and he generally reads about history and the nature of politics and so on. So
Mhm.
he clearly is continually seeking to find new answers. So he's really trying to understand the hidden architecture of the world, and he precisely does do that through history. So he's always trying to first in trying to establish the patterns of human interactions, and then later, when he was trying to find specific inspiration on how to face a specific constellation in politics in his own days, he would always go back and say, how have we all dealt with this before?
Mhm.
Just one example about this kind of where he looks for not just like a specific answer, but to understand the general nature of human interaction. So, for instance, once he's politicized and radicalized in the aftermath of the First World War and of revolution, Hitler suddenly starts to, so Hitler looks back into history to try to see whether there can be justice. Um, and I mean, not just justice on a personal level, but also justice on a kind of national level into
Mhm.
international affairs. And he then concludes, based on studying the history of the last 300 years, that justice supposedly was always just a tool by the powerful to fool the other side, to weaken the other side. And he then says, well, look at how the British treated the Dutch.
Mhm.
Look at how X or Y country was being treated. Look how that country fell. And so from that we can see there is no justice. There's only power. And for him, this is not necessarily even a kind of celebr celebration of that. It's kind of from his own perspective. He basically says you have to accept nature as it is.
Mhm.
That's the only way to survive. And sometimes there's almost a certain kind of melancholy about that. And you can also see this. It's really interesting if you look at Hitler's favorite films. Um, when he watches these films, he engages with this kind of escapist world. He doesn't really, with few exceptions, he doesn't really want to watch violent films, but it's generally comedies. It's even Walt Disney, Cinderella, and Snow White. Those are kind of these. It's an escapist world of where kind of there's harmony, or even later on when he creates this when he spends half of the time for a number of years in his alpine retreat. Again, he is creating this world in the mountains which is kind of escapist. And one more example, if I may, about his approach to history. So one of the things that people have also really underestimated, I think, is to look at the extent to which he looked in the 1920s and 30s back in at history again to find similar constellations to try to see how Germany can escape the fate of becoming a country that is just at the receiving end of things. So one of the things that he actually fascinatingly returns to quite a number of times is this, well, his fear of, he said, in the worst case, that Germans will, unless they change their ways, they will become the Armenians of Europe, of course, referring back to what we now call the Armenian genocide. So Hitler's fear was that in the worst case, Germans will just be treated like Armenians, or at least that they will become a second Netherlands, a once great country that whatever in the 16th century was one of the top dogs, and that by the time of his own days was at the receiving end of things that were could no longer really fully was no longer fully masters in their own homes. And there you can really see how Hitler acted in politics as an applied historian, and also how he had this image of himself as a kind of both a political philosopher and a political practitioner.
And it went from thinking that Germany would become like the Armenians to actually committing genocide himself. Um,
Yes, absolutely. And you can, I mean, there's this kind of famous speech from 1939 where, I mean, there's some argument about what exactly he really said, but I think there are pretty good reasons to believe that Hitler really did warn his generals just before the outbreak of the war. And he said, in a way, he says, I'm paraphrasing here, or I'm teasing out what he's really saying. He's kind of saying either you treat others like Armenians, or in this case, Poles, or you become Armenians yourself. So
mhm.
you have a choice of either committing ethnic cleansing and genocide, or of risking to be at the receiving end of ethnic cleansing and genocide. There's always this existential anxiety in Hitler. Hitler never really just thinks, look, we're the kind of this blonde superheroes and masters of the world. He's always worried that Germans do not have enough power to survive, and he is always worried that Germans are too indolent and lazy to get off the sofas to do what they need to do to survive.
And going right back to the beginning of your book, what I was shocked at was it's possibly the first time that I've read that he was a member of the Red Army. However, he wasn't active in that. Do you think that was cowardice, or do you think he was that was self-preservation?
That's a very good question, but also difficult to answer. I mean, I would say maybe he he kind of was active. I mean, he was active in the sense that he became a representative of of the soldiers of his unit. So maybe to also briefly explain this to your listeners,
Mm.
to your viewers. So there was basically between the end of the war, so November of 1918 and early May of 1919, there were various stages of successively radicalizing revolution in Bavaria. And Hitler decides to stay in the army at a time when it's actually quite difficult to stay in the army. Most people are just being demobilized. Most people want to be demobilized. Hitler desperately wants to stay in the army, and he kind of does whatever it takes to ensure that. One of the ways to ensure that is, I mean, first of all, you have got to, I guess, to cooperate at least to some extent with the new revolutionary regime. But Hitler does far more than that. He runs to become a representative of these, I guess, councils for soldiers. So he becomes he stands for election to be a representative of the men of his regiment, or of his subunit of the of that regiment, and he's being elected. Now, of course, the question now is there's kind of an endless disagreement amongst historians what this means, and Hitler's own explanation, the explanation of historians was, well, look, Hitler was just kind of the spokesperson of all the soldiers who stood against the regime. But that's just not credible. That's just
Mm.
not believable, because we also know, as I found out, is that we're kind of with the election results, with election results of not just these elections for these positions, but also for the Bavarian election in January of 1919, because there were special election districts formed for soldiers who were still in units. So from that, we know which parties people in Hitler's unit voted for. And they were overwhelmingly either moderate or hard left parties. So it's inconceivable that all these people who voted for these left-wing parties would have seen in Hitler, whatever Hitler secretly believed, a right-wing counter-revolutionary extremist. But now we can kind of beyond that, it really just becomes now very difficult to weigh the evidence. I mean, my own explanation here is that it's a combination of the personal and of opportunism and also of political ideas. So with what I do, I mean with the opportunism part, I mean I think the as I already indicated, one of the overriding goals Hitler really has is how to avoid to be demobilized. And um, we've got to bear in mind this is a guy who really doesn't have a family to return to. He
Mhm.
hadn't even stayed in touch with his siblings during the war. They thought he was dead. And Hitler, while being seen as a bit of an oddball or loner in regimental headquarters where he had served as dispatch runner, he was still accepted. So this had become almost this kind of surrogate family. So he now Hitler faced the prospect of having to return to civilian life where he has no social network to return to, and of course also would have got to make a living. So in that sense, I think to some extent, his choices in the months after the war, they're driven by these kind of considerations. Having said that, I don't think that that is a sufficient answer because, uh, in fact, there were other people including the person who had been closest to him during the war and towards the end of the war, and with whom he initially served in this unit. Um, but his peer, he ultimately jumped ship and then joins a counter-revolutionary militia. But Hitler doesn't. Hitler would have also had the opportunity to just be demobilized and join a counter-revolutionary militia, where again he would have a social network, where even he could have gone with his closest peer. So I think we need to take that into account as well. So we need to take seriously that there is something more than just um, pure opportunism in terms of his political development. This does not necessarily mean that I'm somehow suggesting that Hitler is a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, nor that he would support communism or Marxist socialism. What I'm suggesting here is that Hitler, like so many other people after the end of the war, they're kind of searching. They haven't quite their old world has been destroyed, and they're trying to find a new footing. They're also trying to find new political answers. And for Hitler, I think any kind of a political ideology that was collectivist, so not individualist, that it was collectivist, and that believed in the nation, ultimately was something that was within the realm of what he could support. So it is within those possibilities that I think Hitler was searching for new answers and for a political future. So this is why I don't think it's credible that ultimately he would have been supporting of uh, communism or Bolshevik communism and to believe in internationalism and a rejection of the nation. So I think this belief in the nation, even this belief of bringing all Germans together under one national roof, that's the oldest political conviction in Hitler that goes back to his childhood. So it has got to be this combination of a belief in the nation and of collectivism. And that includes anything from, I guess, moderate left-wing ideas, including social democracy, to where he ultimately ended up with. This is not somehow to blame socialism on Hitler. This is not to somehow equate social democracy with National Socialism. That would be ridiculous.
Mm.
The point here is just that Hitler was still searching, and I'm only explaining why this guy who was searching, why trying things out on the political left was something that was perfectly plausible.
And over the years, I've read that Hitler gained his anti-Semitism in the First World War, and your book begins with him protecting Kurt Eisner, who was Jewish. How do you explain that discrepancy in
Mm.
what you say and what some other historians say?
Well, here also have got to differentiate between what I said when I brought out the book, what I'm saying now. Well, let's start with what I said when the book came out. Is the so uh, ultimately this is about the. I mean, there's a very long-standing discussion about when Hitler's anti-Semitism started,
Mhm.
and it's basically the positions range from ultimately believing the story that Hitler himself told, which was ultimately to say, look, I did actually not grow up in such an anti-Semitic environment. Or rather, my family, my own family, was not particularly anti-Semitic by the standards of the time, which is true. But I was then kind of became an anti-Semite through my experiences in Vienna. So that's the one side of, or the one extreme is to ultimately believe his Hitler story. The other extreme is to say, look, there's really no evidence that until after the First World War that Hitler was engaging in anti-Semitism. This is not somehow to say that Hitler was the one person, the odd person out, the one person in the world of anti-Semites who didn't harbor any anti-Semitic ideas. But the point here would be that his sentiments towards Jews were not unusual, and if anything, he was protecting Jews both before the war, during the war. None of his none of his peers appear to none of his Jewish peers in the First World War do appear to have experienced him or presented Hitler as particularly anti-Semitic, and there's the Kurt Eisner episode that you have just described. So ultimately, of course, this is not about. I mean, you could say, okay, why do historians always go on about dates? Who cares whether this was in 1911 or 1913 or 1919? Well, it's obviously not ultimately about the year. It's about the mechanism.
Yeah.
It's not about when, it's about the how. It's about how does someone turn towards anti-Semitism? And here is the answer that I presented in Becoming Hitler was that whatever anti-Semitism of the maybe Garden Party variety Hitler might have harbored until 1919, that it was in 1919, in the summer of 1919, that he that Hitler had his anti-Semitic conversion, that Hitler had his generally also his politicization, his radicalization in the summer of 1919. I argue that it was in midsummer probably related to the realization of to the delayed realization of defeat in the war, because a lot of people really in Germany hadn't quite realized at the end of the war that Germany truly had lost the war. They thought this was some kind of draw in the war, maybe not particularly um, beneficial to the Germans, but ultimately it still was a draw, and they believed the Americans will make sure that there will be a just peace. And then the Versailles Treaty was a total shock, and even more so, the the fact that the German government agreed to it and German parliament then ratified it. That really sent a message home to ordinary Germans. Germany really has lost the war. And it is at that point that, as I argue, Hitler becomes politicized and radicalized. It is at this point that Hitler embarks on this intellectual journey to understand how Germany could have lost the war, but also, as he's not just looking backwards, but looking forwards as well, how could Germany avoid ever to become um, ever to be in a position like that again? And Hitler then realizes, or he thinks that, in line with what a lot of people thought at the time, that the world was moving to a world of world empires or superpowers, we would say today,
Yeah.
and that countries faced a choice of either becoming one of those world empires or superpowers or to be at the receiving end of things. And in that process, Hitler was trying to understand the primary reasons for Germany's supposed domestic weakness and for his external weakness. And for the domestic weakness, his answer really then is it's the influence of the Jews. It's not just Jews, it's the influence of the Jews. He thinks that it is Jewish ideas that really weaken Germany, that explain why there is so much inequality in Germany, why there's so much social tensions in Germany, why Germans turn on each other, why they're not strong enough to fight. And this is, by the way, still an anti-Semitism that very much focuses on finance capitalism, where he ultimately associates those kinds of ideas with Jews. And so his answer then becomes, from that moment onwards, that Germany really needs to rid itself of that kind of influence, and which I argue triggers his sudden conversion to anti-Semitism. And it is then really an anti-Semitism that it is stands at the heart of his ideology. It's a and it becomes a world explanation, a world explanatory anti-Semitism. He, as I've subsequently argued in a piece I've written since becoming Hitler, Hitler really starts to associate Jews as being the originators and agents of the greatest crisis that Germany and Europe has faced since antiquity. And he thinks that Germany and Europe can only survive if um, if the Jews and Jewish influence are eliminated as radically from Germany and Europe as is possible. One thing I still was really struggling with in writing Becoming Hitler is to try to explain why it is that it is that kind of, it is this anti-Semitic world explanation that is so attractive to him. Because again, this is, so imagine this guy in the summer of 1919, he's trying to find answers to the problems of the world. Well, some historians say, well, he was at that point he was in this counter-revolutionary propaganda unit, and he was surrounded by these right-wing extremists. So he was just soaking up like a sponge all these kind of right-wing ideas that were floating around them. I never found that answer persuasive because even in the right-wing political milieu of Munich, there were just so many different explanations,
Mhm.
some of which were very anti-Semitic, others were not. So his radicalization here was really it's like a potluck buffet. So he has to pick and choose. I mean, it's what some scholars call it's a salad bar radicalization. You have got to arrange your own salad. You have to arrange your own meal. So Hitler isn't just soaking something up, but he's actively choosing from what is available.
Mhm.
He goes for the most extreme anti-Semitic explanation that is possible, but he would have, within his own social circles, within even within this course where in this propaganda course where he's exposed to some of these ideas, there were also other instructors who said something very different. So what I never understood was, why is this so attractive? To some extent, I still don't know the answer, but I think I'm a little bit closer to the answer than I've been when I wrote Becoming Hitler, because I think I've realized that maybe I went a little bit too far in arguing that Hitler was not really an anti-Semite until 1919, or at least not that there was anything more than a garden party variety.
Mhm.
I still believe that it is true that this was not in the world explanatory anti-Semitism for him before. It is true that he was protecting Jews before the war. It is true that during the First World War, other Jewish soldiers did not perceive him as an anti-Semite. And it is true that he did various choices in the aftermath of the First World War, which also don't look particularly anti-Semitic. However, um, I've come across a number of pieces of evidence since then that would suggest that by the time Hitler arrived in Munich in 1913, Hitler had started to appropriate anti-Semitic ideas. Again, the problem here is a little bit, the evidence is a little bit iffy. So this is based on, well, initially I found this interview um, that a woman called Elisabeth Grünbauer, who is the daughter of the family with whom Hitler lodged in Munich before the First World War, an interview she gave in the 1990s, where she talks about, based on family recollections and her own experiences, on how Hitler supposedly had already by the time he arrived in Munich, when he talked to her father in on the shop floor, he was a tailor. Um, he repeatedly talked about how he had to leave, also how he left Austria because he didn't want to serve in such a judified armed forces, and other details of his anti-Semitism. So it was first, well, yeah, but I felt uneasy when I said, well, what am I going to do with this? Because how do we know that this woman, this is really what happened?
Mhm.
How do we know that if someone so long after the fact gives an interview, whether there's any kind of truth in that? But then I said, well, the problem is that the other evidence we have from this period is as iffy, or even worse, is even more problematic. Because almost everything we think we know about Hitler from his early years are based either on Hitler's own claims, the claims of Nazi propaganda, or maybe some of his peers, but also brought out during the time when Hitler was in power. So it was very carefully trying to wrote an article where very carefully was trying to make sense of this piece of evidence and looking how plausible this was and so on. As a response of that, two other descendants from this family contacted me in independent from each other, and it turns out so they were descendants of the brother of Elisabeth Grünbauer, that they also had family recollections and photographs and so on, and they all converge. They all ultimately say the same thing, where we also had narratives about injustice perceptions on by Hitler, how he told this tailor how Jews had taken advantage of him and were not giving him a fair price for his paintings and so on. So the point here is not actually to somehow suggest that Hitler became an anti-Semite because Jews mistreated him. That is absolutely not the point. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But this goes back to what I said earlier about first-person perspectives of anti-Semitism. If they're to believe, and I think there are good reasons to believe them, then that would explain a first step on Hitler's anti-Semitic radicalization. It would be a pivoting, it would be a turn towards an anti-Semitism that had political consequences, but that was not a world explanatory anti-Semitism yet, where there was still space for Jews. This would also explain that he still had no problems with Jews during the First World War who were serving for Germany and so on. But, and this now goes back to me struggling to explaining what's happening in 1919, why, when this kind of salad bar radicalization is happening, why he goes for this explanation over alternative ones. So here the argument would be that it's a that it would be what's happening in 1919 is a radical mutation of something pre-existing. So if you already have um, if you're ultimately already open to anti-Semitic explanations, then if it becomes far more plausible or far more understandable that if you are now stand in front of the salad bar and you seek explanation that explains everything, it becomes far more understandable why you just go for the bowl full of anti-Semitism,
Mhm.
and pick that as a world explanation.
Firstly, I love the salad bar of radicalization. I love that as an image. Um, Secondly, your explanation of his growth into full-blown anti-Semitism makes sense because everything else he does in the book, he's trying on different clothes or trying different things from the salad bar because he floats between left and right, and he is searching for things. And I think you're right. If he's got anti-Semitism in his mind from the beginning, and he's looking for different roads, different explanations for being treated badly for losing the First World War. He's going to float in that direction, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean that would ultimately be the argument. This is not to say, again, this is not to say that deep at his heart, before that, he was already blaming the Jews for absolutely everything.
Mm,
If you already have, if something has already been brewing in yourself, in this case probably for about 5 6 years, where you somehow feel I'm not getting quite on in the world, or I'm not quite
mm.
successful in the world as I could be because of what Jews have been doing and how Jews have been dealing with me. Then if suddenly you kind of you try to find an answer for everything, um, th and particularly if there is a major kind of trigger or pivotal moment where you really do suddenly seek totally new answers, where you suddenly feel all the answers of the past that didn't quite work. I need to find a new answer to understand why we're living in a world of crisis, why we're living in such a shitty world. And then it kind of is understandable why you would be more open to an explanation that blames everything on the people against whom you might have already developed antipathy in recent years, rather than explanations that maybe point at something that is still dearest to your heart.
And you you refer to Hitler as a savvy opportunistic political operator. Can you explain to my listeners what you mean by that, and maybe give an example of how he was like that?
Sure. Um, So I'm trying to explain in my book how Hitler was really a extremely talented political operator. Um, the and this maybe also goes a little bit against the grain, because a lot of historians describe Hitler always a little bit of a failure, even in terms of politics. They would go on about how lazy Hitler was, how he slept in late, how he often didn't have any clear-cut idea, how he didn't have a long-term strategy where he already knew exactly what each step of the way would be. Um, and the argument I'm trying to develop here is that this is based on a misapprehension of of the world of politics, of of the success factors of politics, of political operators. I think it's based on a kind of idealized version um, of this kind of idea that a successful political operator or politician plans everything ahead of time and has a clear idea how everything is going to work, and then implements things step by step. But that would be an absolute disaster in politics, because things never quite, there's always, politics is full of the unexpected, of the unforeseen, of contingency, and so on. So what Hitler does works actually therefore really well. So what a lot of historians describe as Hitler's shortcomings are in fact his strengths. So basically it pays for Hitler, it pays off for Hitler that he doesn't plan everything ahead of time.
Mhm.
So Hitler identifies a problem. He generally seeks the general answer to that question. And so he never kind of lets go of the general goal. So for instance, once he has realized that he thinks that the Jews are supposedly at the core of Germany's greatest domestic weakness, he pursues that goal from 1919 until the day he dies in 1945. However, he leaves it to the future to figure out how exactly this is going to be translated into policy. One quote that really opened my mind was, sorry, opened my thinking, or was really kind of revelatory for me, was this quote on how Hitler talked to Grand Admiral Raeder, who said that Hitler said to him once, and I'm talking here from memory, so I'm sure I'm really paraphrasing, there are three kinds of three or four kinds of secrets. There's the kind of secret that I share with you. There are the kind of secrets where I don't know yet myself what, so they're the kind of secrets where I know the answer, but I'm not sharing them with you. But then there are also the kind of secrets where I don't know the answer yet myself, where I leave it for the future to decide what the answers are. And I think that in a way really, there Hitler really explains how he's operating. So
Mm.
is he's kind of saying there is no point in really trying to figure out exactly how, even for instance, trying to purge Jewish influence from Germany and Europe, how exactly you're going to do it. It's enough that you actually know what the broad goal is, and then that allows you to respond flexibly to things as they happen
Mm.
and to get closer to that answer. And here I'm just using Jewish policy as an answer, as an example. This can be used equally for any kind of any field of policy. So what Hitler really is doing is is that he's creating this very flexible way of pursuing a political goal, and that allows him time and time again even to turn uh, moments of that look like defeat into moments of triumph because in politics, always stuff happens. Often Hitler, that's precisely often things Hitler had not anticipated. Initially, Hitler looks as if Hitler really has to pay a big price for it. But then Hitler is extremely talented in turning things around, in seeing and what kind of opportunity lies in any particular moments of crisis, in any particular moment um, that he faces. And so time and time again, Hitler actually gets closer to his political goals through this kind of process. And that is why I actually say that Hitler was an extremely talented and skilled political operator.
What was the role uh, of the Bavarian right wing establishment? What role did they play in either enabling or initially dismissing Hitler?
Mhm. The role of the Bavarian establishment was absolutely central in creating the conditions under which National Socialism could grow in Bavaria. The After the First World War, Bavaria really became the kind of go-to place for radical right-wing extremists in Germany. This was in part because there was in March of 1920 there was this attempt in Berlin to overthrow the government by right-wing extremists. That failed, and as a result of that, in Prussia and other parts of Germany, there were attempts to really go after the people who had tried to overthrow the German government. Not so in Bavaria. What happened in Bavaria was actually not so much that the government that they were necessarily even so much against democracy or that they all agreed with the end goal of these extremists. But what's happening here was this kind of conservative Bavarian establishment who ultimately were terribly unhappy about the new Weimar system, not so much or not necessarily because of democracy, but because they were losing. Bavaria had lost its sovereignty.
Mm.
Under the old regime in Imperial Germany, the in a way, this was really a federation of different kingdoms. Think about Germany as a kind of um, fence that is being built around all the kind of different German houses. So there, Germany is more kind of a village that has a common fence, but where everyone is still masters in their own home. Um, and Bavaria was still had its own king. Um, there was even diplomatic relationships between, say, Bavaria and Prussia. It was a
Mm.
Bavarian embassy in Berlin. Now, with the Weimar Republic, this was no longer a kind of village where everyone was a master in their own house, but there was only one German house anymore left, where Bavaria was just one room. And the feeling amongst the German establishment, the Bavarian establishment was, look, we're no longer masters in their own home. We're no longer sovereign. People upstairs can tell us what to do. So what the political establishment of Bavaria really was trying to do is to try to change this, to try to get back to a political settlement where Bavarians felt they were again masters in their own home. And in order to achieve that, they were kind of willing to go ahead with whoever was also trying to have a go at the government in Berlin. This explains now, after this failed coup in March 1920, they're quite happy for all these German extremists to come to Bavaria. In a way, their end goals are often exactly the opposite because these German extremists, nationalists, they want to have a kind of total, they want to have an even more extreme unified German Germany, where there is maybe not even still a Bavarian room, but there's just one big German hall, while they really want to bring sovereignty back to Bavaria. But what unites them is a common enemy, the government in Berlin. And this now also explains their attitudes towards National Socialism as it first emerges in Bavaria and towards Hitler. And now if we fast forward to 1923, to the year of Hitler's failed putsch, um, this was a time of kind of perceived national crisis where there was talk of revolution on both sides of the divide of socialist, communist revolution, but also of a nationalist revolution. And so the Bavarian establishment, I also think maybe this is the time where we can overthrow the status quo and get back to a sort of state where we're masters in their own home. And therefore, they're also very happy to kind of collaborate with Hitler. So again, they're really creating the conditions for um, for National Socialism and for Hitler to grow, even though they themselves have very different end goals. Then the coup happens in 1923, and they really realize that they burned their fingers badly. They realize that, well, for one, Hitler's coup, of course, fails, but also they realized that Hitler had been trying to play him, to
Mm.
play them. And what actually then happens is something that also often gets a little bit lost in history books because the focus then is on how Hitler, when he was being put into prison, how he gets off far too lightly, and how this court in Munich should have given a far harsher sentence. That might all well be true, but it misses the central point that the Bavarian establishment really learned at great cost to themselves that they had burned their fingers badly. And so, therefore, from the mid 1920s onwards, most of the Bavarian Catholic conservative establishment tries to keep some kind of distance to the Nazis. But that's totally different from what's happening in northern Germany, where it is precisely where all these conservatives somehow think that Hitler will get them to power, or Hitler will help them to pursue their own goals. They think they can control him. It is, of course, ultimately this miscalculation that brings Hitler to the chancellery in 1933. Not so in Bavaria. And as a result, they really built up this kind of firewall to the Nazis from the mid 1920s onwards, arguably with the result that the Nazi Party even never becomes the strongest party in Bavaria, and that also in 1933 democracy falls last in Bavaria. So what I'm trying to argue right at the end of Becoming Hitler is that without Bavaria, there would have been no National Socialism and no Hitler, or at least not in the form that we know it, because they had created the conditions for it to grow. But had all of Germany acted like Bavaria from 1925, Hitler and the Nazis couldn't have come to power.
And how do you explain the um, when he goes to prison in 1924 for the push? He goes in, this, revolutionary, and he comes out a political leader. How do you explain that growth in that
Mhm.
short period of time?
Yeah, in a way, we again see Hitler's ability to turn defeat into victory. And first, actually, defeat seems for him seems total more than usual. So Hitler himself initially thinks there is no coming back from this. So when Hitler, um, after the putsch, Hitler is suicidal, and in fact, he first actually tries to flee the country. People try to race him to the Austrian border, and maybe one of the big what ifs of German and world history of the 20th century is what would have happened if he would have made it across the Austrian border with any chance of coming back to Germany anytime soon. But the car does break down. He's ultimately arrested. He's still suicidal. He initially goes on a hunger strike. Um, Ultimately, people convince him that he should fight back. But at that point, Hitler really just wants to take everyone down with him. At that point, he also plans to write his book as a tell-all book about the prehistory of the putsch. And when he's being tried in prison, sorry, in the court, he also wants to just take everyone down with him. He wants to reveal all these links he had to the Bavarian establishment, how they had been part of that, how they had known what was happening. But ultimately, he does the exact opposite. So when he writes Mein Kampf, um, the one thing he doesn't do is provide a tell all book about what was happening just before the putsch. In fact, that is the one thing he kind of keeps out of the autobiographical part. And in court, he doesn't try anymore to bring everyone down with him. Why does he do that? Well, I think because he realized that this was a great opportunity, finally become the leader, the national figure that he always wanted to be. So I think he's first outraged that in court, all these other people from the Bavarian establishment, they're just blaming Hitler and trying to say it had nothing to do with us. But I think what appears to have happened is that Hitler realized, well, that's great. This now allows me to become the national figure I wanted to be, at least for the last year, that I thought to be, that I was bringing everything about to be, but which hadn't quite worked out. Even the putsch, I mean, today we call it the Hitler putsch. That is not how it was being reported
Mm.
right after it happened. When newspapers across Germany covered this was the Ludendorff putsch, or maybe at best the Ludendorff Hitler putsch. So Ludendorff, of course, being the right-wing German First World War general, who again had found refuge in Bavaria, and he was far better known across Germany. And Hitler had teamed up with him, I think, precisely because he was better known in the rest of Germany. So once the putsch fails, it's the Ludendorff putsch who had failed, and um, Hitler is really mentioned as a kind of also ran, as an also ran, and now in court, during the duration of his trial, that changes. So, for one, all these establishment figures try to blame Hitler. And as far as Ludendorff is concerned, and I guess in part out of the admiration still a lot of people felt what he had done during the First World War and so on, they also don't want to just blame everything on Ludendorff. And in fact, Ludendorff gets off really, really lightly in all this. Everyone just blames Hitler, and Hitler just endorses it because that now allows him suddenly to be the national figure. um, so Hitler gets his prison sentence or fortress sentence kind of far too short, but from the perspective of the time, this was still not looking good for him. Sure, it now looked that Hitler might have had his 15 minutes of fame, that suddenly this was being reported as the Hitler putsch, but the expectation still would have been is now Hitler is, at least for the foreseeable future, he is in a prison. He's not allowed to publish or to appear publicly, um, to make himself heard. So the expectation is that the train of history will move on, and Hitler is not on it. And Hitler will, as new things happen and as there are new opportunities to make him for someone to make themselves heard, he's just not there. But then Hitler really benefits from the inability of others on the extreme right in Germany to exploit the situation. There's a tremendous amount of infighting going on in the extreme right now in 1924 and early 1925. And Hitler, meanwhile, while he was in prison, for one, actually, he'd started working on this book, but also precisely because of all this infighting, he starts to become this mythical figure that people look up to. Here's the guy who really dared to go for it. Here's the guy who's not just words. Here's the guy who isn't just part of infighting. And it is at that moment that Hitler really, now that he is in prison against all expectations, he's becoming this national figure for which people are really kind of yearning and look up to. And that kind of creates an opportunity for Hitler once he comes out of power, so out of prison, and he publishes this book to find a national audience for his book.
And what lessons do you think we can learn from Hitler's manipulation of the media and disinformation during today's period of politics and the political environment?
Difficult to put into one short answer, not least since actually in 10 days I'm bringing out a book initially in German that is precisely about the topic. So it's difficult to know to put this down. I think for one, to distill it down to something, I think for one, the lesson is to first of all explain to understand that we're what is happening here, that it is precisely in this media environment where the similarity lies. People make the mistake that far too often they ask about, is politician X Hitler? Are we experiencing a new Reichstagsfire moment? I think that's the wrong question. The exact form of democratic breakdown will be always be a different one, and maybe also political end goals will be different ones. But the drivers of political breakdown, both then and now, are ultimately the same, which in this new book I describe as world wars of disinformation and demagoguery, and they occur when two things come together: crisis perception and sudden innovation in the means of mass communication that is really disruptive. What I mean with that is when people feel that they really live in a world of crisis, not just a crisis, but the kind of crisis where they think that their own individual and collective survival is no longer assured, and that those up there don't have what it takes to get us out of there, who might have even be responsible for getting us into that crisis in the first place. If that comes together with sudden disruptive changes in the means of mass communications at the time, newsreels in cinemas, radio, illustrated magazines, and so on and so forth, and today kind of the digital innovation, then we have kind of a perfect storm. Then we have these world wars of disinformation and demagoguery, and it is at that point that false prophets like Hitler have a chance, that people listen to them. It is at that point that people are also to conspiratorial thinking. And I think a starting point is to realize that it is there where the similarities lie. And then also to be clear about what kind of promises, what kind then these false prophets, Hitler and the false prophets of today, offer. This brings me back to what I said also earlier about first-person perspectives,
Mhm.
and, for instance, taking seriously what someone like Hitler says about democracy, about repairing rather than destroying democracy, about bringing the real democracy. Why we should also take seriously what Hitler says about the merger of nationalism and socialism. The
Mhm.
point here is not whether, objectively speaking, Hitler is a socialist. Of course he isn't. But it's the kind of promises he makes, it's his self-image and what people see in him. So it's to take seriously that he kind of is, it's a perversion. What he offers is a perversion of what is dear to all of us. or what was dear to everyone, including people at kind of the liberal center. And I think we're seeing today the exact same patterns again. Is again, we're living in a world war of disinformation and demagoguery. Conspiratorial thinking is flourishing. People, again, you see the kind of tribalism that comes when at moments like this, when people are overburdened with stories of and pictures of death and destruction and so on.
Mhm.
We have the same kind of tribalism that sits in there, where also the outsider or anti-migration becomes not a problem, but suddenly seen as the mother of all problems. And it is at that point, these false prophets, who generally do not say we want to go back to the olden days, who are not even necessarily saying everything has to be different, but who just, in a way, they offer a perverted version of our own ideas, democracy, more equality,
Mhm.
justice, all of that. And I think that is why we need to take so seriously what Hitler said. I guess rule of the people,
Mhm.
democracy, socialism. Also, another thing is the people always just say that Hitler is not only that Hitler is the embodiment of evil, but also that Hitler was trying to fight evil, that Hitler um, was that for Hitler, the Jews were the personification of evil. If you look at Hitler's own words, he actually says the exact opposite. He explains why Jews have to be killed anyway, or has to be driven out anyway, irrespective of the question of whether or not they are not evil. So what we really need to learn here is let's take the words of extremists seriously, and let's also realize that their promises are often supposedly quite close to what we think ourselves. This is something that the German novelist Thomas Mann described brilliantly in this essay in 1939 about Brother Hitler. He says this man is a disaster. He but he's our brother nevertheless. And he's kind of explaining in this essay that ultimately Hitler is the exact opposite of everything he stands for, but he can also see himself in it. He can see either certain kind of attractions in that he's just trying to not to follow or the to follow up on. Um, but he can also see how everything is somewhat related to his own values, that just everything has been turned upside down. They have been kind of perverted. And I think we see this today again. And also so often we hear, also by political commentators, that the radical right or the extreme right or the populist right of today, they're really bad, but they're fundamentally different from Hitler and the Nazis. But that's a misjudgment. That's based on this brings us back to the cartoon version
Mhm.
of the Nazis. That's based on the screaming Hitler who gets up in the morning and thinks about, or the Nazi gets up in the morning and thinking, who can I kill today? So compared to this cartoon version of the Nazis with which we are running around the world to look at today's world,
Mhm.
the right-wing populists and extremists of today are totally different. But if we compare them to the real Nazis of the past or the real Hitler of the past, we suddenly realize the populist right and the radical right today is actually really not that different.
Mhm. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And finally, what do you hope readers take away from Becoming Hitler?
I would hope that they'll take away from it an appreciation of how radicalization is possible, how
Mhm.
extremism is possible, um, how extremism can flourish at extreme times, at times where people feel that their individual and collective survival is no longer possible. And my hope is that, I mean, for one, my hope is on one level, it's a nerdish hope. It's a nerdish, it's just the scholar's hope. It's the hope that people appreciate that maybe I have added really a new understanding of one of the biggest questions of the 20th century on how someone like Hitler could become the man he was and could get such a following. But the hope is also beyond the scholar, is that we kind of therefore also understand the nature of extremism in our own world better, and maybe also that we also see, this goes back to the brother Hitler issue, that we recognize um, the temptations that we're also exposed to ourselves. It's not always just others who do bad things, but that also we should see we should really look at ourselves, how we act also in a world of disinformation and demagoguery. How do we act on social media? Are we actually there part of the problem or part of the solution of the problems? Do we really just always act in ways that contains extremism, or do we maybe inadvertently fan the engine of extremism?
Well, thank you, Thomas Weber, for coming on to the briefing room. And the book is called Becoming Hitler, and I'll put a link down below so you can all get a copy of that. It is fascinating, like this conversation, truly fascinating. So before you go, what have you got lined up? You mentioned that you've got a new book that you're writing.
Yeah, in 10 days' time, a book will come out initially in German, which translates into roughly into When Yesterday Comes Knocking, Weimar, The Return of History, for which I brought 19 scholars together, where we precisely try to look at what happens in world wars of disinformation and demagoguery, and where we less ask about what went wrong in 1933, but more the kind of question about what happened in the late 1920s. How is it possible that suddenly there's room for extremist parties to grow and to get mass support both then and now? And I'm trying to, over the next few days, to finish another book, which will come out in January, also initially in German, Nach der Nacht Holocaust Überleben über die Zukunft der Demokratie, After Night, or After the Night, Holocaust Survivors, about the future of democracy. For we're together with the filmmaker Joachim Lang, we interviewed 7 survivors about what they see in today's world that reminds them of the darkest chapters of their own past, why they're so concerned, but also what their recipe or what their suggestions, what their proposals are about what we can do to switch the light back on and how to make democracy more resilient. Unlike with most of my other previous books, these 2 books were initially come out in German, but the hope very much will also be that it will soon out be in English as well.
I hope so, because they sound fascinating as well. So they'll go into my collection. So thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Fantastic and fascinating interview. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
For those of you still with me, thank you so much for your support. And thank you too to my guest, Thomas Weber. I was so fascinated by every word. It was just a riveting conversation for me, and I hope you found it as riveting as I did. Next week, I shall be speaking to historian Prit Buttar about his book Bagration 1944, about the Soviet offensive on the Eastern Front just 2 weeks after the Normandy landings. So, don't forget to like and subscribe, and join me next week for another episode of The Briefing Room.